Well, welcome again to another session of the 17th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. I'm Bob Hales. I'm your moderator. We have with us Dr. Joanne Arender. Did I
Aaron,
close? Okay. She's worked in higher ed for 12 years and currently supports e-learning and classroom technology for the College of Education at the University of Oregon, the Ducks, who got blasted by the Ohio State Buckeyes,
right?
originally from Ohio. So Joanne was really an early adopter of technology and an advocate for digital equity. Her research interests include extended reality with a special interest in virtual reality and leveraging 360-degree video, multi-literacies, language learning and teaching, and learning-centered design. So Joanne, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Bob. So here we are today. We're going to talk about virtual reality, and this is a year looking back. So this was the study that I did for my dissertation for my doctoral program, and so it's kind of a broad overview of the whole program. I will go into some of the specific things about it, but mostly it's just talking about what we did, what went right, what went wrong, what would I do if I used any of this again with a similar population. And so the entire program was housed within a college readiness program in a tier one research institution. It's in the Pacific Northwest, so not here at the University of Oregon, but same region. We supported up to, what was it, 180 public high schools each year, as well as providing training, work experience for college students. Most of the college students that participate in these types of programs were previous participants when they were in high school. So it's still the same pool of student population, just as they move on, we move on with them. And so the main goal of this study was to evaluate if adding VR, virtual reality, to the college readiness program was going to support the students, the mentoring, or language learning. This all happened during the coronavirus pandemic. So I don't know if anyone in here is familiar with how Upward Bound works, but it's funded through the Higher Education Act from 1965. So it's a program that's been around for a really long time, and actually Upward Bound started also in 1965. So as soon as the HEA was passed, the funding was made for assistance for post-secondary, high school education, higher education. Basically, we wanted to support students who weren't being supported in some other way, or who weren't getting the access that they needed to be able to do things that they wanted to do in their future. And so these funds then got pushed into Upward Bound. It was renewed in 2008. But now the programs you might recognize that fall under the same umbrella of money are TRIO, Talent Search, Upward Bound, obviously, and then Student Support Services. All of that gets funded by this original HEA from 1965. And so Upward Bound is just one part of that. The money comes from 100% from federal funding. And then it's almost always housed within a college or a university, and then it partners with high schools in the region. And so this is the actual programs that we used. And so I'll give you a link later so that you can look them. I'm not involved with these different companies in any kind of way other than we use these programs. So Engage is the main virtual communications platform. And so you have to have that one first. And then Victory XR kind of sits inside of that one. So Engage does have some of its own content that you can use, but it didn't have anything we used. We did everything through Victory XR. They create virtual spaces, and they also make actual different kinds of training depending. So they even do K-12 stuff now where you can do an entire school program through this Victory XR program. So all participants in this study met through what we call events in Victory XR and over Zoom. And so both of these platforms are available online, so web-based interface. So you're getting on Chrome or Firefox, but they can also be downloaded as applications. So Windows, Mac, in VR headsets, which is what we predominantly used, but also Android tablets, smartphones, and then all Apple products. It works on all of them as apps. And then the platform that sits inside of this Engage, so it's two platforms, nice and confusing all the time. They build like interactive labs programs, and they can focus on like specific core subjects with a high degree of specialization. And I'll show you one of those later on. So this is an example of kind of what we could do inside of Engage. So everything you see is how Engage would look if you went into Engage today and interacted with it. But all of the content that I'm able to show you is built by Victory XR. And so this is the kind of headset that we use throughout the entire program. All of the students that participated received one of these Quest headsets. And so you could literally take them inside of the headset or in Zoom, or I could stream this to them on Chrome. And then I could show them what part of the headset I was talking about. And then they would be holding a physical headset in their hand at the same time. And so these head-mounted displays is generally the way that we interact with VR. But if the headset wasn't charged or there was some other reason the student wasn't going to use it that day, they could do all of this in Chrome, and it still has the same like 360 view. They could still manipulate items, just you would use your mouse and it would be on a flat screen instead of only in the headset. So when we pulled this up, what we were trying to determine was like, really, is this support appropriate for college readiness programs and for this particular population, right? So would it work for Upward Bound? And also, would it work to support college readiness? We wanted to know what content areas that learners would want to do in VR, and then what academic language they would acquire. And so some of this is because of the requirements of the college readiness programs. There's metrics they have to follow and keep track of. And so if we added VR to their normal programming, it had to meet some requirements that then get reported back to the federal government because it's all AGA funded. And then we wanted to know if they were going to acquire digital literacy skills and then what they perceived they had learned while they were in VR. The whole study was based on these frameworks of dual coding and universal design for learning. So dual coding theory is just the pedagogical framework. It says that you have two systems in your mind, and one of them deals with visual and one of them deals with language. And dual coding is how these two things work together. And so most of you probably are familiar with universal design, but it's the cognitive neuro research science that is the framework to address learner variability through proactive lesson design. And so these two work really well together because dual coding theory says that if you provide multiple means of access to some kind of content, so language plus imagery, then learners have a better ability to obtain the content. And universal design for learning says that if a student can't access content through one way, you should provide them another way. So they work really well together as a framework. So then here's our population. And so if you're familiar with how any of those programs work, like TRIO and Upward Bound, then this probably is something you're already familiar with. But every single participant in this program was considered both low income and a first generation student. So all participants lived at or below the poverty line. No participants had parents who had completed a 4-year degree. We determine income level through free lunch school eligibility. So that's how Upward Bound determines that a student is eligible to participate in their program in the first place. So they pull school lunch data. The individual counties and regions had very similar total numbers of lunch eligible students. So we had 43.4% at the county level were eligible for free lunches, and 43.63% were eligible at the state level. So we feel like it's a very good representation of this particular group of this population. And so the participants in our program were a good representation of the low-income students in the entire region. We did have some interesting little side things that we didn't really expect. Like we had some students with no internet where they lived. And so when this all happened, some of them got access to internet through their public school, and some of them got internet access through us because they had never had it in their home before. A number of them didn't have a computer and had never had a computer until the school had given them one. And unfortunately, most of the time that meant they had a Chromebook, but it was the first time they were interacting with any kind of devices that required some kind of technical skill. So this just shows you like how we filtered down through. So we would have an entire region, it would go down to county, each school district, then the high schools. From those high schools, 176 total participants were in Upward Bound, and only 16 of those eventually were able to completely participate in the VR program. And so you'll see here, we have two sets of participant groups kind of happening. So the total number in the middle is the college readiness participant mentees. So mentee is the Upward Bound term for student participants. We had 176 of those. 55 applied to be part of the VR program. 18 made it through all of the many steps that were required to be able to participate, but then only 16 actually participated. So there were 2 students who were approved to receive a headset, and something happened, but they never actually made it to the final step of doing an onboarding with the headset and then beginning having mentoring sessions within the headset. And then on the other side, we have this group of 14 college readiness mentors. And so these are previous Upward Bound participants that are now in college, and they support high school students. And so 7 of them volunteered to mentor specifically in VR, in addition to the other ways that they were doing mentoring. And then only 4 of them actually provided feedback. And so then here is the cycle of how this program took place. And it starts June 2020, but in reality, there's 6 months prior to this date where the Upward Bound director was working on a grant that paid for all these headsets. So prior to me coming on, a bunch of other work was happening in the background where they got permission from Upward Bound to be able to have these kind of interactions with students. These are all like under 18 students, right? And so once that got approved, then they applied for the grant. Then they had to do all the process. So finally the grant gets approved. They get sent 60 VR headsets. And so now we're in June of 2020, and they don't know what to do with these headsets because they get them and they realize they don't actually know how to do anything in VR. They just thought, oh, this will be a great idea. We'll figure that out once we get the grant. And so then I come on. I very randomly met the director. So when COVID first happened, I was actually supposed to be doing a research study with 360 video and my students that come every summer from Japan. COVID happened, they couldn't come. We tried to convince them to switch to online, wasn't happening. I was in a grant writing class. The director came to speak to us, and then somebody mentioned that I knew how to do VR, and he was like, please help us. So I spent the whole summer of 2020 setting up 60 headsets, helping them figure out how you would send these out to students, and then preparing how we teach the mentors, how would we teach the students receiving the headset on how to use it. So we spent more time on preparation and training than we spent in the headsets doing actual interactions. And so you'll see the consultation period begins like October. So we had to wait for students to come back to school in August, apply for Upward Bound, apply for VR in September, get approved, get it all sent to them all over the state in boxes. And then each student was required to meet with me one-on-one in their headset and on Zoom. So you imagine we're doing this like we are right now, but I also sometimes have a headset on my face, and they would sometimes also too. And so they all had to do these consultations. Then they finally begin actually having mentoring sessions, and they call it mentoring in Upward Bound, but it's a whole lot more than just that mentorship piece. So they do tutoring inside of they mentor a lot of college preparation things. So it gives them access to a student who understands how their lived experience is because they've lived through it also as a previous Upward Bound student. And so they have this insight into how do you talk about the things that are different for us in college versus people who have parents who aren't first gen, or people who have more of that help to get into college, to finish college, to be successful in college, and what all that means to them. So the bulk of what we collected was actually through observations, but we did also do surveys. And so any student that participated, so all 16, was sent the same survey. They were sent 3 different surveys over the whole course of the study. And then the mentors also participated in a similar survey study. And so mostly we were interested in whether or not it was something we should continue to do and offer to future students, or continue to offer to students who were going to be continuing in the Upward Bound program. And basically every single participant said they enjoyed doing it. They want us to do it again. They would participate again. So that wasn't super surprising. I think the most surprising thing was that most of them said that they signed up because they had never touched a VR headset before. They'd never seen one in person. They'd never experienced virtual reality. And so they were less interested in all the things we thought were important about VR for our participants than they were just about having access to something novel that they otherwise never would have accessed. This slide is broken, but what it should be showing is that this is the specific content that's related to school that they reported using inside of these programs, inside of VR. And so math, social studies, geography, and communication were the things that students reported that they on the survey that they did. But when we actually talked to them, and then also through observations, sometimes through images they shared. So at the same time they're doing all of this, we also have Slack channels running where they're sending pictures and talking about what they're doing in VR. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that they never mentioned in the surveys that they were doing that was related to, that we felt is related to directly to subject areas. But the students just didn't see the relationship. And then this is just some of the samples of the kind of conversations that students were having inside of the headset. What was interesting is that most of this is about specifically VR related things, like stuff that isn't working, stuff that isn't showing up how they expect it to. Most of the time we were able to screen share and show them how to work through all this stuff, but we're talking about some students who've never really been on the internet unless the school has had them do it for some reason. And so that skill that you need to be able to like surf Chrome translates perfectly to being in VR. But if you don't have that skill in the first place, it's really hard to get it all on your own. And so we were able to actually go into a space together. And so these are conversations students are having while we're physically in a headset together. We have our avatar, we're facing each other, we see each other in our avatar state, and we're talking, we can hear each other. And then they're trying to figure out like, why isn't something working on a controller, or why can't I manipulate the item that we're looking at? So think about the headset I was showing earlier. We could literally put any object there. So it could be an airplane, an elephant. And so you could be moving. One of the things that was used most often was different cells, because you could blow them up and literally like walk inside of a huge cell of human, mammal cells and plant cells. But so then you're inside of this cell and you're like, oh, but I can't do this thing, or it's saying this direction. It's telling me to do this with words on my screen, but how do I go back to lowercase, or where's the actual option? And so we're navigating, this is us navigating together through VR. So what we did find is that it did offer alternatives to just doing video conferencing. So these kids were already spending most of their day in Zoom or on a Chromebook or some other virtual thing. They were required to go to a lot of different meetings that are related to Upward Bound. And that translates later for them into support when they do go to college, into scholarships when they do go to college. And so they are incentivized to participate in all of these events they go to. But it really gets old. Being a high school student, a lot of them have jobs, some of them had children already. And they just sit in a computer all day long and most of the time on a poor internet connection. So it was nice to have some other way that they could interact with everybody else in Upward Bound without having to be one more Zoom meeting or one more Teams meeting, predominantly Zoom meetings. So I think this was my favorite component of using VR with these students, was that they were able to physically interact with materials. And so when we wanted to talk about going to a specific building on a campus, you could take a tour together and go to a specific building on campus. Then when they physically later, eventually, all of us got to go back and do actual field trips. All these kids got to go to these places that we talked about. One of the most popular interactions in Victory XR was they have the Harvard Library. So students that maybe will never travel outside of their county, much less their state, could go together and walk through the Harvard Library. Places like that for whatever reason, it really resonated with them being able to do these travels without actually leaving. And then I think it was just timely at the same time because they couldn't go anywhere because of coronavirus, right? And then I'll show you pictures here in a minute of some of the physical interactions they did with material, but that ability to be able to manipulate items that you normally can't manipulate seemed to be more valuable than we expected, even though it was something that we were watching for and we thought would be valuable. It just is hard to explain until you experience VR, how different it really is from looking at a picture. So these are the content areas that students reported, and then some of these are slightly different from the survey report simply because students didn't report them on the survey, which was really confusing for us because then they talked about them either with their mentor, in our sessions when we met in VR, in Slack, they talked about it. So we collected all of this data from multiple sources, not just from the surveys, because surveys just weren't gathering all of the data. And so students actually were able to support and interact with all of these different content areas. Some participants actually even said, oh, I couldn't get access to additional chemistry, so I started doing this chemistry unit that was in Victory XR because it was all free to them. So they could just go when they weren't doing actual sessions with their mentor or with someone else in the program, they still had access to everything else that was in the Victory XR library. And the company actually gave us, it was before they had really made it. So they gave us really wide access to their content for that year that we had it. Simply because they hadn't, now they're in lots of schools, and I'll share their website with you later, but you'll see they've grown a whole lot. But when we were using them, they were a much smaller company. So I think the most important part of the content area that they sought out was just that it offered a different alternative to all the other alternatives. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but usually if they have written content, they will make it into audio, or audio gets turned into written content. Well, this way we have this third option where we could also just give you the item physically in a room, which you could also build yourself. So we could have a specific room, we could put you into a college science lab and have you go through an entire chemistry class with an instructor in the front, instead of just saying, here's this handout for you to study, or let's sit in another Zoom meeting. And then the acquisition of digital literacy skills. For me personally, this was the most important part just because it's always been my focus. But every single student that participated lacked digital literacy skills. Like the best they could do was they knew how to sign on because the school had taught them like how to log into their school account, sort of how to access their email, but not necessarily the way we would expect. So this idea of like a digital native, this whole experience completely proved that to be a fallacy, because not a single student had a real pre-existing knowledge of how to use technology or how to take what they knew and use it for something else. And so once we started going through all the trainings, they started to apply like the things we did in Zoom. They were like, oh, this is just like in Zoom where I do X, Y, Z. And so we're learning how they talk about it so that the next time we do it, then we can use that same kind of terminology to explain it to the next group of students, right? But they were able to apply all of the stuff they were learning through the whole year. They started to apply that directly back to VR. And then they're learning how to use VR live while they're also accessing content. So it's kind of a lot of a cognitive load to be putting on these high school students that were suffering through being locked in their houses during a pandemic. But I think that it provided them still with something that they needed at the time, because they chose over and over again to come back and do more interactions and participate more, and to ask, how do I say this thing? Or how do I make VR do this other thing I want to do? So these were the implications we came up with at the end. I mean, so obviously they successfully learned how to use VR. They learned how to use and apply technical language. They applied some of their pre-existing knowledge and skills, like from using their Chromebooks and from being able to sign into email and from having a cell phone for the ones that did have a cell phone. the best part is they had embodied experiences in VR and they had an enjoyable experience. And so I know like our focus in education isn't always on, oh, did our students have a good time? However, when you're asking them to really put themselves out there to suffer through a stressful experience, to try something that maybe is new and scary, it's important that there's a level of enjoyment to continue their motivation. And so all these participants learned a new language during the study. They learned all this new language associated with VR, but they also learned how to talk about what they were experienced with technology so that they could do problem solving. And so there's a bunch of critical thinking skills that are happening when you're doing this. I feel like they directly benefited from being able to access the VR equipment and applications, but maybe not because of all the content areas that they were able to achieve, but because it opened up all these new avenues that they could search that they hadn't really realized they had open to them in the past. And they thought about interacting with content in a different way. So instead of reading their textbook or just doing the study guides that they were given, they had conversations in Slack about how can we use VR or how can we search on the internet to find a different way? Is there a video we can watch? And so you would think, oh, all kids are watching YouTube videos and about things that they're interested in. But if you've never had a computer in your home, that is actually a revelation to be able to realize, oh, I can look up something and then watch a video about it or hear someone else talk about it or see someone do it or do it myself in VR. And even once we get the headsets back, they still have access to all of the different VR stuff that is actually out there that you can access through a web browser. So WebXR is still providing all of them with access to VR now that they know that it exists. Okay, so this is one of the interactions. So you're seeing like a planet. You can sort of see the arm of a student here in this picture. So if it had zoomed out more, this was actually shared in Slack. A student shared this in Slack to say, hey, I'm doing this unit on the planets, and this wasn't an assignment. Nobody asked them to do it. They just were like, oh, this is really cool, and I'm having a good time, and I'm going to share it with everyone else. And so you can actually go and you're a little person, you have a little tablet, you're doing the thing, you're learning all the stuff about the planet, you can click on it and scroll through it. But then for some of these, you can actually go and like stand on the planet, which is kind of, I mean, it's not literally how standing on Venus would be, right? But it gives you this different sense of how you can interact with something that we normally just look at in a book. This led some students to actually finding out when you can go and see these planets, like with the naked eye, how to figure out where they are in the sky, finding apps that do that. So now they're helping themselves to access this information that they didn't realize they had access to along. They just didn't know how to get to it. And so some of the things we said that you should use VR for, and specifically programs like this, where you can put a student in a body, they can put that body in a space, and then they can manipulate items within that space. So TPR, total physical response, this is an ESL thing. So in teaching English to speakers of other languages, we use total physical response activities to support vocabulary building. So total physical response means if I say stand, then you stand. And I show you physically doing that. Well, you can do that in VR. I can say stand, I can say sit, I can say jump. That's not a very nuanced explanation of how TPR works, but that's how you use TPR. And then obviously vocabulary building. So I can show you all the different objects that I want you to learn. We can talk about them and you can manipulate them. Realia, that's another thing that we do in English as a second language, where you physically use objects. So this takes us back to that dual coding theory, where I can give you the thing we're talking about. We can use language to discuss it, and then your brain is going to connect those two things for you. Now your access back to that memory is increased because it's in two places that are also connected. And then we did find that they had social and cultural skills practice. And so students were meeting inside of VR and navigating how do you have this interaction with multiple people at the same time. They're all running around in a building, but as an avatar, right? And so they got to practice those events. And then when they were in there with mentors got to actually help them through processes like, how do you go to the financial aid office and talk to somebody in financial aid to get the help that you need? How do you talk to an admissions counselor? how do you get that assistance from your high school because it's already there? Let me show you how to get that. And so they could actually show up physically and practice those things in VR. So this one is a science unit, and we had every student check no, they didn't do science of any kind, except they did. I mean, so we have the solar systems. This is all things that students shared inside of Slack. So rather than say yes on the survey, this is all from conversations they had back with us and their mentors and each other inside of Slack. And so a student was going to become a father before he graduated, and they had an entire unit on learning about the birthing process. And so the person you see the back of with the hat on, that's actually my student participant. The other two characters in this space, those are computer generated. And then there's a baby that isn't always there when you first come into this space, because the person on the bench actually gives birth to that baby live in VR and you help them. And so he wanted to practice what it was like. If you see the clock on the back, it says 2:33. That's how long he was inside of this particular interaction. And so I'm assuming that he must have done it in sections or gone in and out multiple times to practice, because spending 2 hours in a VR headset, if anyone has spent 30 minutes in one, knows is not exactly an extremely comfortable position to be in, because you have this really heavy object strapped to your head the whole time. And so he shared with everyone, hey, if you ever end up having kids, you should go do this, because he had no idea what childbirth was actually like. And he was like, they did not prepare us in high school for what I'm about to experience, and everything I looked up wasn't as detailed. So he got a very real experience to prepare him for something he was going to be doing very soon. But again, they didn't say, oh, I did science. They just only talked about these things in Slack. And so the like 50% of finding out what content they did was just going through Slack and finding out what are the students talking about this week that they really enjoyed in VR. And so other students actually did go and complete this unit on childbirth, just because one of the other students had come in and said, hey, you should go and do this. Okay, so these are the two programs if you want to look them up. So Engage VR is the main platform that holds everything, and then Victory XR sits inside of it. These two have both changed dramatically since 2021, mostly because obviously we were all using a lot of products during that time, but also because Victory XR was a brand new company back then, and now they've actually like made a bunch of partnerships. They partnered with Meta, so they're a lot bigger. I'm not involved with either of these companies. They're just the ones I use. And Engage, lots of people use it, but there are a lot of other programs out there that are like Engage. And then there's also, I mean, you can literally just Google WebXR and you will get a huge variety of responses of like what that looks like. So while this screen is up, I just want to talk about what the mentors said at the end of the program. And so the focus mostly was on student participants. So the high school students, we wanted to know if it worked for them, how it worked for them, so that we could use that to improve the program the next year, because it was kind of like fly by the seat of your pants, mostly because of COVID. And so when we asked the mentors, hey, what should we do it again? Of course, they all said yes. The strangest part was, and I guess maybe we should have realized that this would be something that they would say, but they wanted more structured events. And so what they meant by that, because we had multiple focus groups where we talked to them, was that they didn't want to decide anything for just VR sessions. So these mentors, the four that actually did the focus group, they also had Zoom students. So they had two groups of high school students they were responsible for. And if you think about it, 14 college students were mentoring 176 high school students between them. And so they were like, it would be nice if we only supported just VR and not both. And if we are supporting VR, we don't want to make any of the choices that are going to be made for how VR gets done. We want you to tell us, go in at this time, do this interaction, and then that's it, you're done. This is the next one. And then have like a scheduled list of when are we going to do all of these different things, rather than basically they did mentorship like they would do if it was face-to-face. But in VR, there's all these other moving parts that they couldn't get a hold of. And so they were like, my student didn't charge their headset. the batteries in their controllers died, their internet isn't good enough. We ended up just talking on the phone because XYZ. The Google Chromebook they have is the only computer in their house. So our backup was always, if VR doesn't work for whatever reason, then you move from VR directly into one of the web-based versions of all of our programs. So it looks exactly the same. And then last choice, go back to Zoom. And then obviously between the college and the high school students, they made a fourth choice, which was get on the phone so that we can still do our sessions. It still counts. We still get to mark that everybody did what they were supposed to do, so that we get this benefit at the end, which is generally some kind of school money or help getting into school, scholarships. So there was always this incentive to complete their mentorship. For the college students, the incentive was it was their job. Literally, they were getting paid to check off that they did all these meetings. And for the student, it was the future help of being able to afford college. And so they were like, that's too much stress for both of us. We need you to have a very specific guided VR moment. We want someone else to schedule all of them. And then we just show up when we're all supposed to. And then obviously some kind of plan for avoiding. Most of the time, the biggest complaint was my headset died halfway through the meeting, or my headset wasn't charged when I started, or I didn't have batteries. So we actually had a whole battery mailing program, which now wouldn't be so much of a thing since COVID is over. But at the time, it was like a huge, big thing. So we had to like put on gloves, wear a mask, wipe everything down with alcohol, pack it all into this package, and then go mail it to students just to send them batteries, because we couldn't send them money. And we couldn't send them to the store to buy batteries, but they needed them for their controllers that were always going dead. And so there's all these little logistical things. When this all first started, there weren't very many ways to control all of the headsets. And so we were stuck with Business Oculus, which wasn't really like the best way to deploy anything to headsets. So you literally are in a room with, 60 headsets, all trying to make sure they're all on, and then trying to make one little Android phone deploy everything to them. And in the office I'm in, everyone has nothing but Mac and OS products. So we literally had to use upward bound money to buy an Android phone so we could load content onto these headsets. Then we find out Business Oculus prevents you from loading anything other than what a company has given you the file to load. So you don't have access to the App Store. So students couldn't do anything except for engage in Victor XR. Part of why we wanted that was for student protection, because they were all minors. But we didn't realize that it would limit us completely, and that companies weren't going to just give us their files so that we could load them sideways. Now there's a lot of some of them are free and some of them are just affordable. Other ways, Business Oculus doesn't exist anymore. So if you want to manage multiple headsets, like say you have under 50, you can use Arbor XR, and then use that to deploy apps to control every single headset instead of putting one at a time and loading stuff. So a lot of it was logistical things that the mentors wanted us to resolve in advance, right? And then they also had this great idea of, rather than deploying all 60 headsets at once, that we should deploy specific high schools at a time. So every upward bound student at each high school would have the opportunity if they chose. And with 60 headsets, we would have been able to deploy to every single high school and have all students choose whether they wanted to or not. Like no one would have been missed. But they said send every single high school for like 2 months at a time, all of the headsets at once. And then whoever the mentor is that goes out there, or whoever the coordinator is that's local, can help do the training. So they're not doing one-on-one training in a headset the first time they're touching a headset, right? And so I think that was probably the best idea that came out of the focus group from the mentors, was just simply that having them all deployed all across the state all at once, one off, wasn't the best way, even though it was the only choice we had at the time. If we would do it again, it would be to each high school, they would have a unit where they had access to the VR headset. This would also maximize how many students. So all 176 students would have benefited from the digital literacy that just 16 received that year. The other thing that we did differently, that we would do differently in the future, is we only allowed just seniors, and then after that juniors, to apply to participate in the VR. And I think that's because we assumed that all of them would try to do it. And instead, when we looked at the numbers, only all of our highest achieving students from each high school chose to participate in VR. So it was the students who needed the least help out of the entire population. So obviously the whole population still required assistance because they're a historically excluded population. However, the highest achieving of all of those are the ones who participated. And so I'm not sure if the results would be the same if it had been all of the students, or if it had been the lowest achieving students, or if it had been a more representative sample of the entire population of all 176 participants. If we would have had the same kind of gains, the same kind of access, the same kind of like intrinsic motivation these students had to just push through issues they had with headsets. And it wasn't just like the charging and the internet. There was also, we had a student who got a headache every time they used a headset, and they continued to use it through the entire program, even though every time they put it on, it gave them a headache. And all it was is that the straps were adjusted incorrectly on their head. And so if this had been an in-person moment, we would have known that. Or if we had anyone had that experience prior to us beginning the program, we would have told everyone from the beginning, when you first put it on your head, adjust the straps this certain way, right? So I think that's something that should be repeated because there's just simply not enough data to say, oh, well, if any high school used this system, that it would provide the same skills and gains for their students. But there really isn't enough data, even now with other people's studies, to say how good or not VR is for students. There's still not a consensus on how long should a student spend inside of a headset. And so at the end of my study, I said, you shouldn't have these students in there for longer than 20 minutes at a time. Part of that is due to like there's a ophthalmology group that has recommendations on how long a person of a certain age should have an object this close to their face that they're focusing on before they focus farther away again. Where most people say you could be in there as long as you want if you're over 12 years old. I would not put anyone, not an adult, not a 12-year-old, in a headset for more than 20 minutes for multiple reasons. The chances of you getting motion sickness, which is the number one problem in a headset, it's less terrible now that the headset's frame rate has increased, but with the original ones especially, and some of the cheaper ones still, you're more likely to get motion sickness from a VR headset the longer you spend in it, no matter if you're someone who's never been motion sick before. And so just that one thing alone for me was enough. That on top of not knowing, because we don't, not knowing if you're going to cause any kind of vision issues for any age group of person that's inside the headset. And then there's this push to think that VR can replace an entire classroom interaction, or that it can be a substitute for a real teacher or a real lesson plan, and it simply can't. It should be something you add on to lessons to provide something you can't provide otherwise. So it's that physical embodiment of objects and yourself with those objects or others. Perfect use for VR, or to be able to go inside an object you otherwise wouldn't be able to be able to see up close an object you don't have access to. So imagine like a group of sixth graders looking at animals they would never see in real life and getting up close and being able to pretend touch them. I mean, so it's those kind of interactions that you need to add in addition to whatever planning or lesson or objectives you already have as a support, rather than as something that replaces everything altogether. Our mentors could meet with our students in VR, but it didn't replace the Slack and the direct phone call interactions that they had, because VR isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's an addition to make as many learning experiences as possible, as accessible as possible. And we need to do a lot more research on it. So this isn't the student right when they go to enter the solar system. So they're actually, you take a rocket ship to a space station and then you get to go to the planets. So that's literally one of our students' homemade avatars. Does anybody have any questions? Right. 30 minutes is a good limit. Someone in the chat said they find 30 minutes to be their limit, and I agree. After 30 minutes, you kind of.
I do have a question. Who was the granting institution for the headsets?
Who was the granting institution for the headsets? Do you mean where did they get the headsets from, Carl?
No, I was wondering, you said that there was a grant to
Oh,
purchase them, and I wondered who
so
the grant was through.
the director of the Upward Bound program did an NSF grant.
NSF. Okay, thank you.
And so I'm not sure, honestly, how he got approval for equipment, because most grants, it's really difficult to get equipment. And so it was something related to the fact that it was Upward Bound. And so they had access to some special grant because of COVID. Yeah. So I haven't found since then any grant that does provide, like if you're just like, oh, I need equipment, like it's not something that is out there generally. Yeah. Titans of Space VR. I will look that up. I'm looking at the chat. I'm pretty sure you can do the Grand Canyon in VR. And so I never actually expected to study VR or to use it in any way. So my original study was with 360 video. And so I was building a cave. So if you don't know, a cave is like a projected room that you can walk into. So it's at least 3 sides, but you can do 4. And so it's like walking into VR, but with your real body, and it's only what you can project, right? But then when my students didn't come, obviously you have to you have to switch gears. And I keep coming back to VR, mostly WebXR now is what I'm interested in, because it's more accessible to more people. Like you don't need a headset, or you can put a cell phone into a plastic headset, or you can also access it all on a headset if you have one. Now that the Quest 2 is sort of affordable, maybe more schools will get it, but I doubt it. Just because the $300 price point just to get in the door with one single headset. And then that's not even with content or support or deploying to all the headsets. And then maybe we'll get 3 years before it's obsolete. So for a technology that's been around for over 20 years, it still isn't there. I would like to develop for VR. So have you ever, I'm going to kill your name, Knox?
Yes, that's it.
So do you use Unity at all? Have you ever?
Yes.
So you should be able to do some of that stuff in Unity, or there's a lot of really good space-specific astronomy things that you can get for free online. So if you just literally Googled like astronomy web XR and went from there, but I've had pretty good success putting 360 videos into VR with Unity. And since it's free for educators, it's a nice way to get in. And then it has a lot of tutorials for how to like help you get started. But Unreal is also free. It was like the gold standard, but I normally suggest Unity just because it has a lot of like teacher educator programs that you can do for free. And they give you blanks that you can start with. So that you're not writing all of it from scratch yourself.
Yeah, there's a lot in the asset store. Yeah, more my concern there with that question was how can you scale this beyond, 30 or 40 or however many students,
So you
just
stick to
100.
WebXR. You don't put them in a headset, or you make the headset part something you do in a lab. So you would have like, so a lot of our classes here that are science, or, we even have some of our English classes have a lab, philosophy has a lab. I would put it in the lab space. So normally we have like a group of 300 or 150 to 300, and then the labs break it into 30s. And 30 is very manageable for putting people in a headset. But if you can't do that, or it's more like an online course, just go WebXR. because then students can determine how they're going to access it themselves. Some of them might have a headset. Some libraries, our library specifically, has headsets that students can check out. So you can make it something where you tell them during this term, you need to go check the headset out from the library if that's the way you want to do it. And then you let students choose, like, are they going to do it on their computer, or are they going to do it on their phone, or are they going to do it on an actual headset? And then they'll have a slightly different experience, but that can be part of the conversation they have then when they reflect back on what they did in VR. I
Thank
think
you.
it's totally doable, especially with how much astronomy stuff there is out there that you can look at. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, Bob, later your assignment is to go find Grand Canyon 360 videos so you can see what it's like to be in the Grand Canyon from Oklahoma.
Yeah, I've always wanted to do virtual reality of the different trails in the canyon for people who will never be able to go below the rim.
That would be a
Yeah.
wonderful project.
That's on my retirement to-do list.
Just get a really good 360 camera.
Yeah,
That's the key there. If
yeah,
the camera's really good, then the rest of it will work out.
yeah,
Right? Carl's right. Starting with Google Earth would be good because there's going to be something there already.
yeah. Mm. Well, any more questions? Probably the way I said that stopped any potential questions, but yeah, Joanne, thank you. I really appreciate everything you shared with us. So I'm gonna stop the recording.